There are moments in life that change the way you look at the world forever. For my father, that moment happened on a quiet stretch of the Mississippi River in southern Louisiana. Nearly 30 years ago, he spent most of his life as a commercial fisherman. Long before GPS, cell phones, or powerful boat motors, he and the rest of my family survived by fishing the backwaters, marshes, and isolated sandbars that most people avoided after sunset. Growing up, I heard countless stories from him. Some were funny, some were dangerous, but there were 3 stories he never liked talking about. Every time someone asked, his voice became quieter, and he always ended with the same sentence: "Some places don't belong to us, and if something there notices you, pray it loses interest." When I was a kid, I thought he was only trying to scare me. I don't believe that anymore, because every detail he told me stayed exactly the same, no matter how many years passed. And after seeing the place with my own eyes, I finally understood why. The first incident happened during a late summer evening on an old riverside road that no longer exists. At the time, my father was only 22 years old. He was walking home with my grandfather, William Carter. Everyone around our town respected my grandfather. He wasn't a preacher, he wasn't a sheriff, but people often came to him whenever they believed something strange was happening. Some called him superstitious, others believed he had a gift. He never argued with either side. That evening, the sun was disappearing behind the cypress trees. The river flowed quietly beside them. The only sounds were insects, distant frogs, and their footsteps on the dirt road. To their left, the Mississippi River. To their right, a wall of dark woods that seemed almost black as daylight faded. Then, my grandfather suddenly stopped walking. He didn't say a word. He simply turned his head and listened. "What is it?" my father asked. My grandfather didn't answer. He slowly raised one hand, signaling my father to stay quiet. For a few seconds, everything was completely still. No wind, no birds. Even the frogs that had been making noise only moments earlier had gone silent. Then they heard it. At first, it sounded like a distant gust of wind racing through the trees. But something about it felt wrong. The trees weren't moving. The tall grass along the riverbank wasn't moving either. Yet the sound kept getting louder, closer, closer. It wasn't coming from the river. It wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming straight down the road toward them. My father later told me that he couldn't explain why, but every instinct in his body was screaming that whatever was making that sound wasn't natural. He looked at my grandfather. For the first time in his life, he saw genuine fear in the old man's eyes. Without taking his eyes off the road, my grandfather grabbed my father's wrist so hard it almost hurt. "Move." It wasn't a shout. It was barely a whisper, but it carried a sense of urgency my father had never heard before. My grandfather pulled him several feet toward the tree line. The very next second, something invisible rushed past them. It hit with the force of a speeding truck. The air exploded around them. Dust shot into the air. Leaves spun violently in every direction. Branches bent as if something massive had just pushed through them. Yet, there was nothing there. No animal, no person, No vehicle, nothing. The sound continued down the road for another few seconds. Then it suddenly disappeared. Just like that, silence returned. The frogs started calling again. The insects came back. It was as if nothing had happened. My father stood frozen, staring down the empty road. "What was that?" he finally whispered. My grandfather kept looking into the darkness for several long seconds before answering. "I don't know." Then he looked directly at my father. "And I don't want to." He turned around and started walking again, faster this time. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the journey home. Years later, my father admitted that the thing which frightened him the most wasn't the sound. It wasn't the invisible force. It was my grandfather. Because if a man like William Carter, a man who never seemed afraid of anything, could be terrified by something he couldn't even see, then maybe some things are better left unseen. At the time, my father believed that would be the strangest experience of his life. He was wrong. A few months later, something was waiting for him on a lonely sandbar in the middle of the Mississippi River. A few months passed. Life returned to normal. My father convinced himself that whatever happened on that riverside road had been a freak accident. Something impossible, but still explainable. He never imagined that the river itself would prove him wrong. It was late August. The Louisiana heat was relentless. Even in the early evening, my father and his two younger brothers had spent the entire afternoon setting fishing lines along a remote stretch of the Mississippi River. Back then, very few people fished that far from town. There were no houses, no docks, no lights, only endless water, scattered sandbars, and miles of marshland stretching toward the horizon. As the sun began to sink, they pulled their flat-bottom boat onto a narrow sandbar to eat dinner before checking their lines later that night. The place felt deserted. The only sounds were insects buzzing through the marsh grass and the slow movement of water against the side of the boat. One of his brothers opened a small cooler. The other unpacked sandwiches and coffee. For a while, everything felt completely ordinary. Then my father looked up. About 200 yards away, near the center of the sandbar, he noticed what looked like a young banana tree growing by itself. That caught his attention. Banana trees didn't grow out there, not naturally, but he didn't think much of it. Maybe someone had planted it years ago. Maybe floodwaters had carried it there somehow. He shrugged and went back to eating. A few minutes later, something made him glance up again. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. The tree looked closer, not by much, just enough to make him question his memory. He frowned. Maybe I remembered it wrong. He looked away again, tried to ignore it. The conversation continued. His brothers laughed about something, but my father wasn't listening anymore. Something deep inside him felt uneasy. A cold pressure settled in his chest, almost against his own will. He looked back a third time. His blood ran cold. The tree wasn't where it had been before. It had moved, not inches, not a few feet, dozens of feet, closer to the boat. And then he realized something even worse. It wasn't a tree. It had never been a tree. It was standing perfectly still, watching them. Its shape only looked like a tree from a distance. As the sunlight faded, the outline became clearer. It was impossibly tall. Its body was pitch black. Its arms hung far below its knees. And its head didn't seem to have a face at all. My father couldn't breathe. He blinked hard, hoping the figure would disappear. It didn't. Instead, it tilted its head, as if it had just realized they were looking back for what felt like an eternity. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The only sound was the gentle splash of water against the side of the boat. My father's younger brother noticed the expression on his face. "What's wrong?" My father didn't answer. He slowly pointed toward the center of the sandbar. Both of his brothers turned to look. At first, neither of them saw anything unusual. Then one of them quietly whispered, "What is that?" The figure hadn't moved. It simply stood there, tall, silent, perfectly still. It looked almost human, but every part of it felt wrong. Its arms were far too long. Its body was unnaturally thin. And even from that distance, it seemed darker than the fading evening around it. My father later told me something that has always stayed with me. It wasn't the way it looked that scared me. It was the feeling that it already knew we were there. No one suggested walking closer. No one joked. No one tried to explain it away. Every instinct told them the same thing. Leave. Now. My father quietly reached for the long wooden push pole resting inside the boat. He didn't take his eyes off the figure. Neither did it. The moment his hand wrapped around the pole, the figure moved. Not by taking a step, not by shifting its weight. It simply exploded into motion. It came charging across the sandbar with impossible speed. Its legs barely seemed to touch the ground. The distance between them disappeared almost instantly. 40 yards, 30, 20. It wasn't running like a person. It was moving with violent, unnatural bursts, as if something was dragging it forward faster than any human could possibly run. Go! My father slammed the push pole deep into the riverbed. The boat lurched violently away from the sandbar. One of his brothers nearly fell into the water. The current immediately caught the boat. It drifted away just as my father pushed again with everything he had. Behind them, something hit the edge of the shoreline. The splash was so loud, it echoed across the river. But my father never looked back. Neither did his brothers. Every second felt like an hour. The current carried them farther into the river. Only after several minutes, when the sandbar had almost disappeared into the darkness, did my father finally dare to turn his head. There was nothing there. No figure, no movement. Only the empty shoreline and the tall marsh grass swaying gently in the wind. No one spoke during the trip home. None of them could explain what they had seen. Years later, whenever my father remembered that evening, he always asked himself the same question. What would have happened if we'd waited just 5 more seconds? He never found an answer, and deep down, he was grateful he never did. But the river wasn't finished with him. The worst encounter of his life was still waiting. It happened one cold autumn night, in a narrow canal surrounded by cypress trees. After the incident on the sandbar, my father stayed away from that part of the river for several weeks. He never told anyone outside the family what had happened. Even if he had, who would have believed him? Eventually, life moved on. Fishing wasn't a hobby. It was how our family survived. No matter how frightened he was, he couldn't simply stop going back to the water. A few months later, A close friend invited him to spend the night fishing in a narrow canal, several miles east of the river. The place had a reputation. Local fishermen avoided it after dark, not because of alligators, not because of snakes, because people claimed they heard things there, things that never showed themselves. My father laughed it off. At least, that's what he told his friend. Deep down, he still hadn't forgotten what he'd seen on the sandbar. The canal was barely wide enough for 2 boats to pass. Ancient cypress trees leaned over the black water. Their twisted branches blocked most of the moonlight. Long strands of Spanish moss hung from the limbs like tattered curtains. The farther they traveled, the quieter the world became. By sunset, they tied their flat-bottom boat to the roots of a large cypress tree. They checked their fishing lines, cooked a simple meal, talked for a while. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with everyone. His friend stretched out near the middle of the boat. The friend's younger brother lay beside him. Within minutes, both of them were asleep. My father, however, couldn't. Something about the place felt wrong. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt heavy. The air was thick. Even the insects seemed strangely quiet. He lay on his back, staring into the darkness above, listening, waiting. He had no idea what he was waiting for. Then, he heard it. Tap. A single sound. Soft. Almost too quiet to notice. He raised his head slightly. Nothing. Maybe a fish. Maybe a turtle bumping the boat. He lay back down. A few seconds later, thump. This time, the entire boat shifted. Not much. Just enough for the wooden hull to creak. His eyes snapped open. His friend didn't move. Neither did the younger brother. Both were still sleeping. Then came another sound. A slow scrape. As if something incredibly heavy was sliding across wet wood. His heartbeat began to quicken. He wanted to wake the others, but something told him, "Stay quiet. Listen." The sound stopped. For a moment, everything was silent again. Then, the bow of the boat suddenly dipped several inches into the black water. Not from a wave, not from the current, from weight. Something had just stepped onto the front of the boat. My father couldn't see it, but he could feel it. The boat slowly tilted forward. The ropes tightened against the tree. The wood groaned under pressure. Whatever was standing there, it was impossibly heavy, and it was getting closer. My father couldn't move. It wasn't that something was holding him down. His body simply refused to respond. Every muscle was locked in place. His breathing became shallow. His heart pounded so loudly that he was sure the others would wake up. But they didn't. His friend, still asleep. The younger brother, still asleep. It was as if whatever had stepped onto the boat had come only for him. The bow sank even deeper into the water. The rope tied to the cypress tree stretched tight. The boat let out a long, painful creak. Then, another step. The entire boat shifted again, slowly, deliberately. Whatever was there was walking toward the center of the boat. My father couldn't see a face, couldn't see a body, but he could hear the wood responding to every step. Creak, silence, creak, silence. Each step was slow, controlled, almost patient, as though it already knew there was nowhere to run. My father squeezed his eyes shut. He later told me that in that moment, He believed he was going to die, not by drowning, not by an animal, but by something he couldn't understand. Then he remembered something his grandfather had told him years earlier. If fear takes your voice, let your faith speak for you. So, under his breath, almost too quietly to hear himself, he began reciting Islamic prayers, not because he expected a miracle, but because it was the only thing he had left. The words came out shaky at first. His lips trembled, his throat felt dry. Still, he kept praying. The next step never came. Instead, the boat became completely still. For one long second, nothing happened. Then, bang! The entire boat jolted so violently that my father nearly fell over. His friend and the younger brother woke up instantly. What happened? Did we hit something? They grabbed their flashlights and pointed them toward the front of the boat. Nothing. No person, no animal, no floating log. The bow slowly rose back out of the water, as if an enormous weight had just been lifted away. The canal fell silent once again. My father said the silence afterward was even more frightening than the footsteps, because whatever had been standing there had vanished without making a single sound. No splash, no footsteps, no broken branches, nothing. He never told his friend what he had been praying. He simply said, "I think we should leave before sunrise." His friend looked confused, but after seeing the fear on my father's face, he didn't argue. No one slept after that. The three men sat in silence until the first signs of dawn began to break through the cypress trees. The darkness slowly gave way to a cold gray morning. Birds started calling again. The insects returned. It felt as though the swamp had suddenly come back to life. Only then did my father finally take a full breath, for the first time in hours. He stepped onto solid ground. His friend untied the boat, while the younger brother stretched and laughed. "Guess none of us got much sleep." My father forced a smile. He didn't tell them why. Instead, he walked to the front of the boat. The bow was wet. That wasn't unusual, but something else caught his attention. The thick wooden plank near the front had a fresh dent in it. Not a crack, not a scratch. A deep, rounded impression, as though something unbelievably heavy had pressed down on it during the night. His friend leaned over. "That wasn't there yesterday." My father nodded. Neither of them could explain it. There were no broken branches above the boat, no fallen logs, nothing that could have dropped onto it. The mark had no obvious cause. They packed their gear and began checking the fishing lines before heading home. That's when they noticed something else. Nearly every line they had set the evening before had been disturbed. Some hooks were completely straightened. Others had simply disappeared. One line had been cut so cleanly, it looked as though someone had sliced it with a knife. His friend blamed snapping turtles. The younger brother suggested a large alligator. My father said nothing. He knew what snapping turtles looked like. He knew what alligator damage looked like. This wasn't either of those. As they headed back toward town, his friend finally spoke. "You were awake most of the night, weren't you?" My father hesitated. "Yeah." "Did you hear anything?" For a long moment, he thought about telling the truth, about the footsteps, about the weight on the boat, about the prayers. Instead, he simply replied, I don't think we should fish here again." His friend looked at him for a few seconds, then quietly nodded. I was thinking the same thing. Years later, that canal was abandoned by most local fishermen. Some said the fish had disappeared. Others claimed they heard footsteps on empty boats in the middle of the night. No one ever proved any of those stories. But one thing was certain. My father never returned there. Not once. Even after 30 years. He still refuses to say that place's name out loud. Because, according to him, some places remember the people who visit them. And if that's true, maybe it's better if those places forget you instead. For years, I treated these stories like family legends. Every family has them. Stories that get told around dinner tables. Stories that grow a little with every retelling. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. But there was one thing that always bothered me. My father never changed a single detail. Not once. Whether he told the story 5 years later or 25 years later, every place, every sound, every word stayed exactly the same. People who make things up usually change details over time. He never did. One afternoon, I finally asked him a question I'd been thinking about since I was a kid. "Dad, do you think it was a ghost?" He looked out toward the river for a long time before answering. Finally, he shook his head. "I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know." Then he said something I'll never forget. "The mistake people make is thinking everything out there wants to hurt you." He paused. "Sometimes it just wants you to leave." That answer stayed with me. A few years ago, I drove to the area where those events supposedly happened. The old dirt road was gone. Most of it had been swallowed by floods over the years. The sandbar had changed shape. The canal was almost impossible to recognize. Nature had reclaimed nearly everything. Standing there, it was hard to imagine that anything terrifying had ever happened. It looked peaceful, beautiful even. But the locals still had something to say. An older fisherman noticed me looking toward the water. He walked over and asked if I was lost. I told him my father used to fish there decades ago. The old man became unusually quiet. Then he asked me a question. "What was your father's name?" When I told him, he stared at me for several seconds. Then he slowly nodded. "I remember him. He wasn't the only one." Before I could ask what he meant, he climbed back into his truck and drove away. That was the last conversation I had there. I've never gone back. Maybe there was a logical explanation for everything. Maybe fear and darkness can make ordinary things seem impossible. Or maybe there are places in this world where we are simply visitors. Places where something ancient has been watching long before we arrived, and will still be there long after we're gone. So if you ever find yourself alone on a quiet river, after the sun has gone down and the night suddenly becomes too quiet, don't ignore that feeling telling you to leave, because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you can see, it's what has already seen you.